Chapter 2 is all about considering self. If through this course, this is the chapter you take out of the course and you utilize going forward, it will greatly improve your interpersonal relationships and communication. Because the source of our communication is who we are. Wearing a mask wears you out. Faking it is fatiguing. The most exhausting activity is pretending to be what we know we aren't. And we're going to talk about masks. And we're going to talk about trying to find the authentic you through reflection and how we get there. We want to talk about today is considering self, our self-esteem, the source of self, and the relationship self. Self-awareness, according to Mead, is a sense of who we are, and we only gain that by taking the perspective of others. We know who we're trying to present ourselves as in the world, but is that how we're being perceived? And is that truly who we are? Me is the internalization of others' perspectives on ourselves, the perspective we get of ourselves from how we treat others. So our interpersonal relationships is forming, in many ways, who we are and our perception of who we are. We oftentimes rely on social comparisons. And this is a case of where you're trying to compare yourself to others. And this is oftentimes where we find ourselves in social media influencers, perhaps celebrities, perhaps religious or political figures, where we're comparing our lives to theirs to determine our value. So if someone is being successful because they're interacting in this way, we try to interact that same way. If they're always funny, we try to be funny like them. We compare ourselves in order to determine who we are and where we're at. The critical self-reflection is taking that a step further, because social comparisons are not necessarily fair to you. Instead, finding out who you are versus about who you are versus someone else is important. You have to look at, what am I thinking? Why do you think that way? Why do you feel that way? You know, I hate it when I go to this store, and why do I always feel that way? Well, if you do some self-reflection, you might find out it's because you always feel stressed or pressured, or perhaps it's after your work. There's something else relating to it. How are you communicating? How are your thoughts, feelings influencing how are you communicating? Are you a morning person, and so you wake up and you jump out of bed and you're ready for the day? Or are you one of those people that, boy, I hate when the alarm clock goes off, I'm going to hit that snooze button 12 times. You're just not in the mood. And so at that first part of the day, you're communicating horribly. So you know, well, if I want to continue a relationship with someone I see in the mornings, I need to change that, or I need to find a way to communicate with them that, you know, don't talk to me until after I have my first cup of coffee. How am I feeling, and how can you improve your thoughts and communication? These are all part of critical self-reflection. Now, self-concept is an overall perception of who you are, and this comes from the looking glass self, the idea that we define our self-concepts through thinking about how others see us. It's kind of when you're looking in the mirror, you know, you're noticing the flaws, you're noticing whichever, you know, you might dislike how your hair looks that day, you might dislike, you know, some aspect. My left eye is a little higher than my right eye, and I don't know if people notice that, and boy, that, or it might be positive. So you have to kind of take a perspective of looking at how others are seeing you, not just physically, but in your communication. I mean, are you always in a cheery mood? And so when you're in a bad mood, suddenly everyone notices? Or are you always in a bad mood, and so everyone avoids you? You have to look at that. A person's self-growth comes out of your interactions with others and perceptions of others. And this begins at an early age. Our parents automatically are giving us information. Oh, don't act that way in school, or don't act, go outside. Well, now play because you're outside. They're always kind of giving us some guidance, trying to direct us, but it's on their perception of how we should be. So automatically we start to see that our concept of self is originally rooted not in how we feel, but how others feel about us. Self-concept clarity, the overall idea of who we are based on beliefs, attitudes, and values you have about yourself. And this also does come from family or from other social influences. Who are you as a person? Are you passionate? Is education important to you? You have to evaluate these and put them on a scale and decide, okay, this is important to me. My academic success is important to me, so I got to get the A's. Well, that might mean you don't go to the movies on a Thursday night. There might be different things where, as you're developing a concept of what's important to you through reflection, you start to see you have to prioritize different parts. Now, this is something people oftentimes get kind of mixed up. They're self-fulfilling prophecies. This is not necessarily part of self-reflection. Self-fulfilling prophecy is actually what we presume someone else will do. It's like, oh, well, Tom, he's always struggled in school, so I expect him to get an F. Well, then he comes back with an F, and it's a prophecy that's self-fulfilling. You already expected him to get that. Self-efficacy, on the other hand, is ourselves. We can't change Tom, but we can change ourselves. So if we want to look at being successful, we have to predict ourselves being successful. We have to say, I'm going to go into this relationship and I want to make it work. And this is how I'm going to do it. But of course, you can always do it the negative way too. So you have to find self-efficacy that is impactful for you and positive for you. Now, when you're doing the negative ones, when you're always negative, oh, I can't do this, I can't get through this class, I'm a horrible morning person, I just can't do it. Well, guess what? Eventually you enter into self-doubt, and that self-doubt hurts your self-esteem. Because you're like, oh, I just can't get up at 5 in the morning and get to work, so I'm expected to be late. And then your job gives you a bad job review because you're late, and so now you have low self-esteem, which means, well, my boss doesn't like me because I'm always late, and so I'm not worth anything, so I'm not going to try. And boom, suddenly you see how it circles and how one problem leads to another one. So you have a negative set of beliefs about yourself, and that lowers your self-esteem. And now you have a low self-esteem, you create more negative thoughts, and it just becomes a vicious circle. The self-discrepancy theory suggests self-esteem is determined by how you compare the two mental standards. This is a concept that the book really brings out. I'll move into Carl Rogers here in a moment, just because Carl Rogers is a little bit more of an impactful individual within the field of psychology talking about this. But in the book, they're talking about the ideal self. This is the perfect you. This is the you that you picture on a perfect day. You jump out of bed, you're energetic, you're ready to go, your attitude's great, and everything works that day. The ought self is what other people think you should do. Now, this also comes in with self-fulfilling prophecies, because others may have self-fulfilling prophecies about you. If your parents didn't expect you to get up before noon, guess what? Well, I have no pressure to get up before noon, so I'm not going to get up before noon. So, ought self is the person others wish and expect you to be. Self-discrepancy theory really does focus on perception of others and your own perception. Maintaining life happiness and self-esteem is avoiding and limiting contact with people who routinely tear you down, and surround yourself with people who build you up. Seems like an easy suggestion, and we actually talk about this a lot when we get into the later chapters of the book, but it is true. If you have people that have self-fulfilling prophecies about you that's negative, then you're not going to shoot for the stars. You're just going to kind of go along with, well, they expected me to be late, so I was 20 minutes late. Or they expected me not to put on nice clothes, so I showed up in horrible clothes, type of thing. And those type of people tend to tear down your self-esteem. People that, basically through social comparison, they want to have someone that below them, and you get to be that person. And so they have a tendency to tear you down so that they can rise up. And that is the type of people you want to avoid. Now, when we get to Carl Rogers, what I like about his model is it really looks at your self-image and ideal self. Self-image, again, is somewhat of how you view yourself, where you are, and your ideal is where you want to be. Now, as you can see on the one side, on the incongruent side, those don't overlap very much. In other words, let's say you want to be a rock star, but you don't know how to play a guitar. And so those two don't match. You can't get to one from the other. But when they start to overmatch, you become a good musician, you can play the guitar, then suddenly your ideal self, that rock star you want to be, and who you are start to merge. And the more that those two merge, the less stress you have in your life. The self-image is very important. And it also causes something that's called self-actualization, which is if you start to say, okay, I want to achieve this, and you start taking those steps towards it, you're actually creating your own path forward. Main thing I want you to take from this is this quote, though. The good life is a process, not a state of being. It is a direction, not a destination. In other words, let's say you become a good musician and you're playing locally. Do you want to then stop, or do you want to adjust that ideal self to account for who you have became? In many ways, you want to make sure you're still progressing forward, and that's where Carl Rogers really is talking about. It's a dynamic thing. It's not a destination. You can't truly find happiness, but you can make happiness. Now, for this first section, we're going to end with several quotes by Carl Rogers I want you to reflect upon, and go ahead and post below and tell me what your thoughts are. I find I am more effective when I can listen acceptably to myself and be myself. In other words, he's talking about how we're not perfect. And we have to accept that we're not always going to be that ideal self. And so as we're thinking through and we're reflecting on ourselves, we need to realize that where we are isn't necessarily where we're going. And to be reflective, you have to give yourself a little bit of leeway. It becomes easier for me to accept myself as a decidedly imperfect person. If you always have to have the perfect words, always have to have the perfect moment, always have to have perfection, life isn't perfect, so you tend to struggle. So what you need to do is, again, reflect back and say, okay, I'm not perfect, I'm human, but by accepting that, I can then find a foundation of which to build upon. It seems to me to have value because the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I change. In other words, through self-reflection, he's finding who he is. And by finding who he is, he can find out how he wants to become a better self. And so he's able to reflect upon that and become a better person, maybe achieve something new. Go ahead and take some time. Once again, you can have a break in between this lecture, but think about this, post, and I'll see you in the next lecture.